All the stuff that Zeihan talks about is happening just in reverse, because all the geopolitical stuff, who's got the choke point over Suez? Who's got the oil producing nations? Who's got basically its BRICS? Part of the reason for the withdrawal is that the US and Canada actually have a lot of oil from fracking and so on and so forth. If you could unblock Keystone XL and all this stuff, if you can unblock nuclear, the US would do much better. A lot of the natural resources can't be exploited. Reds want to exploit those resources. Blues are preventing them from doing it, laying down in the road at Burning Man and all this type of stuff. We're used to thinking about the world in terms of being cut up by piece of land into countries, the US and China and Russia and India. The other way of cutting up the world is not by the lands, but by the minds. So you take all the nodes in a social network, you take Facebook, you take Twitter, you take all of them combined, color nodes by their tribe. And this is the cloud view of the world as opposed to the land view of the world. This is looking at the minds, not the lands. And so you're dividing up the minds into people who are near each other socially, cognitively, even if they're far apart in physical space. We take for granted that we have a map of the lands. That was actually a huge technical achievement. For most of human history, we didn't have a map of the world. 1492, Europeans didn't know that North America even existed. Surveying, cartography, that's actually a very difficult science that we totally take for granted today because we have GPS and we have satellites and we have drones. Once we had those maps, then people started fighting because they could see it. We are still in the very early stages of cloud cartography. You can create a proximity matrix and you can project that down into a so-called planar graph, just like you can for distances on the surface of the Earth. And then from that, you build the N by N matrix of who is connected to who. A is following B, B is not following A. That's one of the things about digital space. It's asymmetric, potentially, whereas physical space, if you're close to me, I'm close to you. Given that graph, you can literally make a map. You can see this tribe is here, and they control this cognitive territory. And the cognitive territory is really important because if you don't control the cloud, if you don't control people's minds, eventually you don't control the lands. Take Korea. Does Korea exist? Well, North Korea exists and South Korea exists because the communists controlled the minds of what are now the North Koreans. That was never a historical division within Korea until modern history. And the capitalists controlled the minds of the South Koreans. That difference became so large cognitively. They weren't just in separate social networks and considering themselves part of the same country. They literally became two different countries. You couldn't do cross-border trade. You couldn't even do cross-border travel. They were literally at war with each other. So when you have a tribal separation in the cloud, that presages a serious conflict on the land. Once you actually really start taking the internet seriously, part of the reason people can't take it seriously or don't take it seriously is they don't have good visuals of it, right? Each node is a congressman. Each node is colored blue or red by whether they're Democrat or Republican. And each edge between them is whether they voted the same way on the same bill. They voted yes together, they voted no together. In 1951, it was a uniparty. Democrat, Republican didn't matter as much as American. FDR had essentially succeeded in forming a national unity government of a sense by basically crushing all of his opposition. By 2011, 60 years later, this is like mitosis. The two had split apart. They're basically just straight party line votes almost all the time with a few rare things in between. And this was actually 12 years ago. You can literally see every 2 years the groups getting further and further apart. Here's a totally different data set. This is 6 years ago at the social network level. Now, each node is not a congressperson. It's just like an individual American, individual Twitter user. Blue is Democrat, red is Republican. And some of the big circles are media outlets. And edges between them are whether they follow each other or interact with each other. What can you see? This is also coming apart. And this was 6 years ago. Since then, reds now have their own social networks. That cell division has also been happening at the level of the public. And people will say to me, oh, Twitter isn't real life. Of course it's real life. It's upstream of real life. The cognitive separation will precede physical separation. When you can see the same phenomenon reflected in two totally different data sets, you're seeing that it's not red, white, and blue. It's red and blue. For some combination of cultural and other reasons, Twitter, like 1700s, there was a scramble for America and then the scramble for Africa. All the European, like there was this new world that opened up. And all these powers like the English and the Spanish, they all contended for that. That's what Twitter is. It's like the place where the equivalent of the English and the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Russian, everybody's slugging it out. This is like the nexus point. It's the network of the networks. It is the public war zone. We've all been teleported up into the cloud, and all the physical borders and all the conventions that kept people in their own lanes for literally decades or generations. Today, we have taken that to the opposite extreme, where we're talking about the U.S. as a nation state. It's not a nation state. It's an empire where it has lots of different nations, lots of different nationalities, which have totally cognitive separation, genetics. There's very little in common beyond like an economic union nowadays. So it's not a nation state. It's an empire. It's like the Roman Empire. It had lots of ethnicities. It's like the British Empire. It had lots of ethnicities under it. There's yet a third thing, which is like a civilization state. So that's like arguably the EU or China or India are things where there's lots of differences between, let's say, Spanish and Finnish people, or between Tamil and Gujarati people, or between the Han and the Hui or whatever. But you can get to like a civilizational level unity between like Europe and India and China. They're like civilization states where there's some lowest common denominator unity despite lots of lower level differences. Much of the 1800s, 1900s was warfare, ethnic cleansing, purges, back and forth. After World War II, all of the Germans in like Eastern Europe were like basically forcibly deported out of there because everybody was mad at the Germans for obvious reasons. Lots of people died. That's how you got essentially almost linguistically uniform areas. They weren't like an organic kind of thing. It was something that there's a lot of warfare and bloodshed and purging. We just showed with the graph in 1951 where the U.S. was totally unified. You know what was having the total opposite of that? Take China and India. China was in the middle of the Chinese Civil War, or had just finished with it, 1949. Decades of cat and dog fighting between the communists and the nationalists, and they were allied against the Japanese. It was like a temporary truce. China was not unified then. Just massive confrontation, fighting, bloodshed, killing, back and forth for years and years and years. Before it became Pakistan and East Pakistan, you see partition. Why was British India divided 75 years ago, right? This is something that all Americans should actually learn about. This is a much better model for what's coming to the U.S. than civil war. If in 1951, the U.S. was highly unified, 1947, the U.S. was highly unified, the Uniparty, 1947, India was the total opposite. Basically, after the British left India, the federal government like vanished. They announced that there were two countries now, India and Pakistan, because Jinnah wanted a country for Muslim people, and Gandhi and Nehru went along with it for various reasons. Basically, the British only announced the borders like 2 days after independence. So all these people near the border, Hindu and Muslim, who had been living near each other for generations in peace, suddenly woke up and they're like, whoa, I'm in the Muslim-only country. I'm in like the Hindu majority country. And basically mobs of Muslims and Hindus essentially started, it's tit for tat. And basically Muslims were driving Hindus into India. And then there was retaliatory stuff. Muslims fled into Pakistan. And basically this was this absolute chaos and pandemonium where these two tribes that were far apart mentally, partly because the British had encouraged people to vote by their own religion and so on. They had taken these latent differences and exacerbated them. I'm not saying they didn't exist before the British, but they had become reified. So this was essentially when the British left and that form of identity went away, you went to religious identity. And this led to basically millions of people dying, being displaced, just absolute chaos for months and months and months. Notice that Pakistan has this green area and also this green area. If you were making a new country, you would never, from a map standpoint, why would you ever have like two wings that are separated by the other country that got born at the same time that you just fought with? How are you going to get there? You have to sail all the way around, Indian waters to get there. You don't have the internet. This geography makes absolutely no sense. It's a total opposite of like Wyoming or Colorado with the straight lines. This geography makes absolutely no sense except as a reflection of cognitive differences. You just look at the map, you can tell that this is not like a sustainable kind of thing. Eventually, East Pakistan broke away, and that was a whole war, the War of Independence of Bangladesh, and India helped on that. That was a whole mess. And there was a genocide of the people fighting for their independence. So India is like more friendly to Bangladesh than it is to Pakistan. Do you know what this looks a lot like? So this is like blue and red, okay, at the granular level. And then you also take a look again at that map of partition. Notice how there's like Pakistan and East Pakistan here flanking India. The flyover, states are like the Hindus in this analogy. The Republicans are like the Hindus, and the blues are like the Muslims in this analogy. And it looks a lot like the setup for partition, especially because there's so many other things that are happening. Blue states are becoming bluer and red states redder. Even NYT has been admitting this, like here, see this? In a contentious lawmaking season, this book that came out years and years ago, okay, this has been going on for decades, it's been building for decades. A big sort, why the clustering of like-minded Americans is tearing us apart. This came out like 15 years ago, okay? All right, 2009. The migration of reds, from blue cities to red states, right? Why people are fleeing blue cities for red states. All of that is happening. The reason of civil war doesn't seem realistic to people, even though it's part of American history, of course. Civil war was like highly organized. You had guys in uniforms, they had militaries, and they had generals. They were conquering territory. And before the Civil War, like the North and the South weren't just the geographic and cognitive separation corresponded, like slavery was legal in the South and it wasn't in the North. So everybody is lined up for something that looks like a perceptible sort of border conflict. Today, it's not like that. Blue and red are like cheek by jowl. It was like Hindu and Muslim in India. Like American partition would be like BLM, but the right shoots back. Chaos. Tribe on tribe. I want to be careful about what I'm saying. I'm not saying they've converged all the way. To a greater extent than I'd ever expected when I was born, India and the US are converging, okay? India today is more like the US of the 1950s. That was a melting pot that was putting people together into like an American nation, an American ethnicity. Teddy Roosevelt, all these guys campaigned against so-called hyphenated Americans in the early part of the 20th century. There's a whole immigration cutoff in the 20s. It's like a hiring freeze to let your culture gel at the company. A nation's immigration policy is like its hiring policy. You don't want to hire everybody, and you don't want to hire nobody necessarily. You want to hire skilled people, and that's what a lot of other countries do. It's not necessarily what the US says, but leave that aside. 1950s America took all these different folks and put them together with a common ideology, and it had its flaws. There's all these criticism of the 50s, X and Y minorities were disenfranchised and so on. Those are all real things. That's also the time that people go back and think about, okay, the US was really powerful then, it was really unified. There's an advantage to that too, if you can make that work. And that was a country that could build because there's a uniparty, people agreed on things. You could build the interstate highway system. There weren't constant lawsuits, there wasn't constant fighting. It had low rates of crime. That is kind of where India feels like to me today. That's why I'm all in India. That's why I'm investing in India. It has developed an ideology that has unified its people. People will attack it as Hindu nationalism, but there's actually like 3 levels to it. India can build trains, the Vande Mataram train. India can land something on the moon. India landed Chandrayaan on the moon, dark side of the moon, for 1/4 the cost of a San Francisco bus lane. 75 million versus 300 million. It built its parliament building, 125 million for like a third of the cost. India was never able to execute as a society until like the last 10 years, 15 years. It's like finally got it together. Now, what's the converse, right? Unfortunately, the US is becoming like the India of my youth, because I've seen this movie before. The India of my youth had a lot of smart people who just couldn't get it together as a society. It was riven by race and ethnic conflicts, religious conflicts, ideological conflicts. It had lots of socialist lunatics, and it had an impressive diaspora that went abroad, and it had flashes of greatness, individual greatness at the company level, but it was basically just held down by the inability to cooperate as a society. It's not an insult. I'm not attacking or, I mean, India did have poop on the streets, and I mean, it still does in some ways. As I said, they're converging. They haven't converged, but it's so much cleaner than it was, and vice versa for the US. In 1950, you're at peak US, highly centralized, everybody's organized, interstate highway system, and so on. China and India are completely disorganized internally. China just got off the Chinese Civil War. India just got off partition. China and India are the most unified they've ever been. And the US, it's already far apart cognitively, and I think it'll get farther apart physically. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying that I mean, it's bad in many ways. I prefer that the US was unified and good. This is not cheering it. I don't want the plane to crash. I am, however, observing that altitude is declining. And I'm trying to say, what happens next? I may be wrong. If you look at this, the US is actually losing ground on high net worth and on talent relative to where it was. Do you see this map, like millionaire migration map? This is from 2022. Russia, China, of course, Russia, Ukraine, they're losing from the Ukraine war. China's losing because it was under lockdown, Hong Kong as well. who's gaining? Switzerland, Cyprus, and Greece, actually, because they were letting people come in from Russia. Israel had a lot of people make Aliyah. Dubai, Singapore, or Dubai's capital city, UAE, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand are all gaining a lot. You might say, well, Balaji, this map still shows the U.S. is green. It's plus 1,500, Canada's plus 1,000. But the U.S. is way less than even Australia, plus 3,500. In 2019, the U.S. was like plus 10,000. So here's the 2019 graph, okay? Same guys, same methodology. U.S. was like plus 10,000. So pre-pandemic, the U.S. was like plus 10,000. And the U.S. has basically dropped 86% in 3 years, 4 years. These are folks who can move anywhere in the world. So that's an early signal that global capital has found other places. And that's Dubai, that's Singapore, that's Israel, that's Australia, that's New Zealand, that's Switzerland. It's not Russia, China. They're also losing people, even more than the US is. The reason that's important is people think of this as a bipolar world. It's not just a bipolar world. That's one axis. There's also all these small countries that are well-run startup city types that are gaining people. So this is from August 2022, right? Canada replaces the U.S. as top destination for talent. Here was Canada. Look, that's just one place. You can argue its noise in the rankings. The more interesting to me is Japan, Singapore, New Zealand, all rising. That's like the rise of Asia. Australia, Japan, Singapore, New Zealand, those are all English-speaking or English-friendly in Asia time zones or closer to Asia time zones. Germany, France, etc., declining. The world economy has moved back to Asia. Most of recorded human history had the geocenter of, let's say for 1,000 years, the geocenter of the global economy, to the extent we can measure it, was like somewhere, intermediate between Europe, India, China. In fact, like, why did Columbus sail to the U.S.? He wanted to find India, right? That's why Native Americans are called Indians. India was like a big trade center. That's why people want to go to China, the Silk Road and so on. All that stuff was, the great riches were like on the other side. So it was a big part of European history for a long time. The last 100-something years have been very atypical, where essentially since, in the 20th century, Europe and the US were so dominant that we just think of the world economy being centered here. This is where we grew up. Since then, it's been rocketing back over here at an incredible speed, much faster than it did. One of the graphs I show for history is running in reverse. You're going back to the future and the global center is moving back to Asia. So that is why you're seeing talent going to Asian time zones, and you're seeing money do that as well. Those countries that I mentioned there, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, even Dubai in many ways, actually, they subscribe to something, but that thing is not Western. It's actually internet values. Internet first, not America first. If you're really chest thumpy America first, I understand where that comes from. I'm actually more sympathetic to the red who's like proud of their country and proud of their history and so on. I get where that comes from. That's at least better than burning down your own country and saying we're the worst people in the world. If I have to choose between the two, I'll choose the red over burning down your country. The thing is also that America first actually, in a not completely obvious way, results in America last. If you say America first, Turkey says Turkey first. India says India first. Everybody says that they're first. And then your free trade zone breaks down, and you're admitting that the rules-based order that you set up is no longer credibly neutral, and that America first will mean that the U.S. breaks every rule in order to benefit itself. And does it even exist anymore because it's red and blue, not red, white, and blue? Basically, America first is a signal that you're going to be incredibly selfish to other countries. America's only 4% of the world. It's not a win-win ideology. It's an ideology that comes from being backed into a corner and feeling we've been too generous, we've given of our own blood, we've given our own treasure, we've lost in free trade, we've been the policemen of the world, it's time for us to get paid. The problem is that while I understand where that comes from, that is not the way to actually, for example, North Korea is North Korea first. Argentina, like Juan Perón was all about Argentina first. Simply being, quote, proud of one's country is not enough to turn it around. Argentina's unprecedented economic boom to bust history. We know about the money printing, but it wasn't just money printing. It wasn't just like insane, like left statism. It was also insane right nationalism, okay? Because here's the thing. Until the middle of the 20th century, such a scenario is simply unimaginable. Argentina was super rich. It had all the stuff that Zeihan thinks is really important, like the geography and all that type of stuff. It was growing. It had endless supply of raw materials. It was isolated from the wars of the old world. It had a great position on the peninsula. And then what happened was Argentina's decline was well underway. So tripled state expenditures. When nothing else worked, go into debt, print money, let inflation gallop. But they also did this. As part of an Argentina first policy, tariff barriers were put in place to protect the country's weak industrial base. Gas plants were purchased as well as electric companies. A staggering number of inefficient state companies were founded. This is just like the $300 million SF bus lane or the $50 billion TSMC thing, which isn't working. You know, SoftBank, right? SoftBank spent how many billion dollars? It's not easy to turn $100 billion into $100 billion of technology. It's easy to waste the money. And if you go and look, they would not listen to us inside Arizona's troubleshooter. Basically, you can argue, oh, the media is always negative and so on, and that's fine, and I would normally agree with you, but I consider this an admission against interest. Basically, when they're spending tens of billions of dollars on this chip plant, it's not getting anywhere. And in fact, you know, Taiwan has to import like 500 Taiwanese to try and make it work, and they're not getting the visas. All of the kind of permitting and regulatory things you'd think would go away in a national security issue aren't there. So the point is, just like Argentina, this Argentina first policy of you know, tariffs and trying to bring industries home and lots of spending that's being tried in the US now, and it looks similar. America first is a little bit more intuitive for sure than it's a systemically racist country, let's burn down my house, okay? That's stupid. March 2022, America is now the champion of democracy, and they have to go and get the Indians and Africans need to get in line for the war with you know, Russia and, you know, over Ukraine. We're building up America now with tens of billions of dollars in wasteful spending by the same government that can't build a bus lane is going to build a semiconductor plant? No, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not. What Elon did is the gray strategy. This is how we win. Okay, here's the cheerful part. Here's the, I'm not actually a negative person. I think I'm realistic or whatever. At least I'll point to something when it's blowing up before other people do. And I'm usually right about that. Even timing might be wrong. 2019, Obama did an American factory and he was advocating for cooperation with China. 2019. 2016, the New York Times was yelling at Trump for calling the Taiwan president before he called the China president. And Obama's guys were, do you remember this? Basically what happened actually, in many ways, Trump won ideologically on many dimensions, especially the nationalism stuff, right? In 2011, to save our economy, ditch Taiwan, 2011. Okay, New York Times. Why? They wanted to sell Taiwan to China basically for $1 trillion in debt forgiveness, which was actually a substantial amount at the time, about 10% of US debt. Here, American factory, 2019, Chinese Americans went into this with the best intentions. Obama's movie, advocating for kind of multilateral trade, right? Here's Donald Trump, you know, saying China a bunch of times, and everybody was mocking him for saying that. Here is New York Times saying Trump speaks with Taiwan's leader an affront to China. Among diplomats, there was similar shock. This is a change of historic proportions. Democrats were pro-China. I'm talking a few more years back. Democrats were also pro-Russia. So, I mean, remember Mitt Romney said Russia's our biggest rival or whatever in, you know, and Obama made fun of him. You want your 80s foreign policy back. Even a few more years back, everybody was obsessed with terrorism in the Middle East. Nobody cares about the Middle East at all anymore in the US. Now that's coming out about the Saudis knowing about the attack and so on beforehand. The full history of 9/11, you know, who the heck knows what really happened. Like the fact that that thing was declassified 20 years later, that Saudi intelligence knew about the guys on the plane. There's all this, you know, basically invading Iraq when maybe the Saudis did it. Who the heck knows? Okay. Though, of course, it's a different Saudi government now. So it's sort of like getting mad at them when they've increasingly secularized under MBS and they're actually looking up as opposed to the previous government that did this. So it's kind of like getting mad at China today for being communist when it's less communist than ever been. War on terror retrospective. So $8 trillion spent. Iraq is now trading in yuan. Assad won the Syrian civil war. Afghanistan, as you mentioned, controlled by the Taliban. Saudi and Iran alliance against the U.S. Millions dead and displaced. What's the conclusion? Fight Russia and China together. Okay, and just to kind of recap this, right? $8 trillion, 900K direct debts. Iraq is trading with China in yuan. Comprehensive strategic defeat. Assad won the Syrian civil war. He's shaking hands over here. The U.S. tried to sanction people, but they normalized relations with him anyway. Taliban now controls Afghanistan. Blinken is impotently calling on them to reverse the ban on women at universities, being ignored. China brokers this huge deal between Saudi and Iran, and 2 months later, 3 months later, they both joined BRICS. Obviously, 37 million people displaced. The entire Syrian refugee crisis came out of that. And after all of this, suddenly taking on Russia and China at the same time. That recent announcement about like the new BRICS nations, when you go and look at it, all the stuff that Zeihan talks about is happening just in reverse, because all the geopolitical stuff, who's got the choke point over Suez? Who's got the oil producing nations? Who's got, all this stuff? Basically, it's BRICS, right? Part of the reason for the withdrawal is that the US and Canada actually have a lot of oil from fracking and so on and so forth. If you could unblock Keystone XL and all this stuff, if you could unblock nuclear, the US would do much better. A lot of the natural resources can't be exploited. Reds want to exploit those resources. Blues are preventing them from doing it, laying down in the road at Burning Man and all this type of stuff. The choke points, Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, Suez Canal. So Iran, UAE, and Saudi, and Ethiopia, that's why Ethiopia joined. They got this straight. And Egypt just joined BRICS. They just basically locked up this crucial shipping lane. They don't yet have the Straits of Malacca, but they do have South Africa, so they've got the Cape of Good Hope. And they've got Argentina, which is, the path around South America. If you look at where BRICS would go next, they'd probably try and get Panama, and they try to get some of the countries around the Straits of Malacca. Now you've got free shipping lanes. Now you're correct, by the way, that India has a rivalry with China. India joins these Chinese organizations to make sure that they're not too anti-India. They basically steer them in like a neutral-ish direction. Because India also doesn't want war in the Middle East. Russia, Iran, Saudi, China, India have basically said, we're going to step in and we just want the Middle East to be a free trade zone where everybody's at peace with each other. All the wars are now receding. The U.S. did blow up the Middle East. The peace in the Middle East is coming when the U.S. is retreating from the region. Sunni Shiite is kind of like Protestant Catholic. Everybody in the Middle East has had 2 decades of war and religious fundamentalism, and the tone there, if you visit there, if you're flown through Dubai, even Riyadh or something, it's moved in a much more secular direction. People just kind of want to make money now. I'm not saying everybody, I'm not saying there are still, of course, there's still fundamentalists and so on, but they're at peace with Israel too, right? They're reaching out to Israel. These are cats and dogs fighting amongst each other. The EU, Europe fought amongst itself for a long time. And then you got the EU, and it's got its faults, but it's been like relatively stable. It might be heating up again, but it was relatively stable for a while. Where I see the trend line going is the Middle East becoming a stable gas station kind of area for much of the world, especially Asia, that wants all that raw material. It's like a comprehensive strategic law. Basically, the countries that are dominant there are the countries that are, it's not the US. Now, maybe the US doesn't need it, but let's at least say the $8 trillion was spent for nothing. A million people died, tens of millions of people displaced, right? Israel feeling that the US is cutting it off. Israel is sensing that both on the right and the left, whether it's like Ilhan and the squad on the left, or it's sort of the rising-ish nationalism, America first on the right, that there is, it's not yet at consensus, but just like the China thing, how China, like the consensus just shifted in 3 or 4 years without any big announcement. I feel like, unfortunately, that is shifting on US-Israel, and Israel is looking for other partners because it doesn't feel the US is going to be super reliable. You saw Tablet's article actually recently, Jacob Siegel said, end US aid to Israel. Why? Because he's like, the US has Israel on a string and it's supporting like the left-wing movement within Israel. So Israel should just cut off the aid and, rip the Band-Aid now before it gets ripped later, right? The tribal lens is also the digital lens. Rather than thinking about it as the map of the lands and the countries of the world, you think of it as the map of the minds and the social networks and the tribes of the world. And this somewhat overlaps with the offline, but not completely. China building a great firewall, it has the combined physical border, language border, and digital border. So it's tried to maintain like one tribe, like vertical integration. India's also somewhat done this. In the West, you have lots of tribes. Increasingly, the tribes don't necessarily match the lands. You have, at a minimum, blue and red within each country.